Human relationships have always been one of the most fascinating subjects in psychology because they reveal how our minds work beneath the surface. Sometimes people behave in ways that appear confusing, even contradictory. One of the most common and emotionally complex experiences many people go through is when someone disappears from their life for months without contact, and then suddenly returns. In particular, when a man comes back after months of silence, the situation often leaves people wondering what truly happened in his mind during that time. Was it regret, loneliness, curiosity, guilt, or something deeper in his psychology? To understand this behavior, we must first understand a fundamental truth about human nature. People rarely make emotional decisions based on a single reason. Human behavior is layered. It is influenced by memory, ego, fear, attachment patterns, personal insecurities, and the unconscious need for validation. When someone leaves and later returns, the reason is almost never simple. It is usually the result of psychological processes that have been quietly developing over time. The human brain does not process relationships like a logical machine. Instead, it creates emotional bonds through neurological pathways connected. 2. Reward systems. When we connect with someone emotionally, the brain releases chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin, which create feelings of pleasure, safety, and attachment. Over time, these emotional associations become embedded in memory. Even if a relationship ends, the brain does not simply erase those pathways, it stores them. This is why months of no contact do not always mean emotional closure. The mind continues processing unfinished emotional experiences. In psychology, this is often related to what researchers call the Zeigarnik effect, which suggests that unfinished emotional situations remain more active in the mind than completed ones. When a relationship ends abruptly or without clear emotional resolution, the brain continues revisiting it subconsciously. So when a man returns after months of silence, the first thing psychologists consider is whether the relationship remains psychologically unfinished in his mind. Even if he appeared detached or indifferent when leaving, that does not necessarily reflect the internal emotional process that occurred afterward. One of the most powerful psychological forces behind this behavior is the process of emotional comparison. When people leave a relationship, they often believe that their life will improve without that person. The brain creates expectations about freedom, excitement, new opportunities, and emotional relief. But reality sometimes challenges those expectations. As time passes, the mind begins comparing past emotional experiences with current ones. If the new experiences fail to match the emotional comfort or validation previously felt, the brain begins reevaluating the past relationship. This process happens quietly. It does not always occur consciously. For example, imagine a man who ends a relationship believing that something better awaits him. In the beginning, his brain focuses on novelty and independence. The excitement of change temporarily overrides emotional reflection, but novelty fades. When routine returns, the brain begins remembering the emotional stability and familiarity that once existed. Memories also have a psychological bias. Over time, negative details tend to fade faster than positive ones. This phenomenon is known as emotional memory reconstruction. The mind starts recalling moments of laughter, understanding, affection, or support, while minimizing the conflicts or frustrations that once existed. This does not mean the relationship was perfect. It simply means the brain selectively reshapes memories to reduce cognitive discomfort. Another important psychological factor is ego regulation. Many people assume that when someone leaves, they have completely moved on. But human ego operates differently. The ego does not like to feel rejected, replaced, or forgotten. When someone walks away from a relationship, they often expect to remain emotionally significant to the other person. If months pass, and the man begins to suspect that he may have lost that emotional significance, a psychological discomfort can arise. The mind starts asking subtle questions. Did she move on? Does she still think about me? Did I matter to her? These questions are not always about love. Sometimes they are about identity and validation. Humans naturally want to feel impactful. In other people's lives, when someone believes their absence no longer matters, it can trigger a sense of psychological insecurity. Returning becomes a way to test whether that emotional connection still exists. This leads to a very important behavioral observation psychologists often make. When a man returns after months of silence, his communication style reveals a great deal about his internal motivation. Some men return with clear emotional honesty. They openly acknowledge the time apart, express regret, and demonstrate accountability for their absence. This type of return often indicates genuine emotional reflection. Other times, the return is subtle and indirect. A simple message like, "Hey, how have you been?" might appear casual on the surface, but psychologically it can represent a testing strategy. The mind is probing the emotional environment before fully revealing its intentions. This behavior is rooted in fear of rejection. The person wants to re-enter the connection without risking vulnerability too quickly. Body language and tone also reveal deeper psychological signals during reconnection. A man who maintains consistent communication, asks thoughtful questions, and shows emotional attentiveness may be demonstrating genuine interest in rebuilding connection. These behaviors suggest emotional engagement. In contrast, inconsistent communication, delayed responses, or vague conversation patterns often indicate emotional uncertainty. The person may be experiencing internal conflict. Part of him might feel drawn back to the relationship, while another part remains unsure about commitment or emotional responsibility. Psychologists also analyze what someone does not do. Absence of certain behaviors can be as revealing as their presence. If a man returns but avoids discussing the past, avoids emotional topics, or refuses to acknowledge the previous distance, it often indicates psychological avoidance. Avoidance is one of the most common defense mechanisms humans use when they fear confronting uncomfortable emotions. Avoidance can stem from guilt, shame, fear of conflict, or emotional immaturity. Instead of addressing the deeper issues that cause the separation, the mind attempts to reconnect on a surface level while suppressing the past. However, unresolved emotional patterns often resurface later if they are not consciously addressed. Another powerful psychological reason men return after months of silence relates to loneliness and emotional regulation. Humans are social beings. Even people who value independence still require emotional interaction to maintain psychological stability. When someone spends enough time alone or experiences emotional disappointment in other areas of life, the brain naturally revisits previous emotional connections that once provided comfort. This does not always mean the person wants to rebuild the relationship long-term. Sometimes the mind simply seeks emotional familiarity because it feels safe. Familiar emotional environments require less psychological energy than building entirely new ones. Real-life situations often illustrate this pattern. A man might reconnect after experiencing stress, career struggles, or personal setbacks. During difficult moments, the brain searches for emotional environments where the person once felt understood or supported. The past relationship becomes a mental reference point for comfort. Another behavior psychologists observe involves timing. The moment someone chooses to reconnect can reveal important clues. If a man returns during major life transitions such as job loss, relocation, or emotional hardship, it may indicate that the reconnection is driven by emotional need rather than long-term commitment. However, timing alone does not define intention. Some people truly grow during the time apart. Months of distance can allow individuals to reflect on their mistakes, develop emotional maturity, and recognize the value of a relationship they once took for granted. Personal growth often changes perspective. Psychologists sometimes see this when a returning partner demonstrates behavioral change rather than just verbal promises. Growth reveals itself through consistent actions. A person becomes more communicative, more accountable, and more emotionally transparent. These behavioral shifts indicate internal psychological development. On the other hand, if someone returns with the same patterns that existed before the separation, it often suggests that the underlying psychological issues remain unresolved. The relationship may repeat previous cycles of confusion, conflict, or emotional distance. Another fascinating psychological dynamic involved in this behavior is known as intermittent reinforcement. This occurs when emotional attention is given inconsistently rather than consistently. Intermittent reinforcement creates powerful emotional attachment because the brain becomes conditioned to anticipate unpredictable rewards. In relationships, this pattern can unintentionally strengthen emotional bonds, even after separation. When someone disappears and later returns, the emotional intensity of reconnection can activate powerful neurological responses. The brain interprets the return as a reward after a long period of emotional absence. This is why some people feel strong emotional reactions when a former partner reappears, even if they believe they had moved on. The brain responds to the sudden reactivation of old emotional pathways, but there are also psychological risks involved in these situations. Repeated cycles of disappearance and return can create emotional instability. It can damage self-esteem and create uncertainty about trust, security, and emotional reliability. When someone repeatedly experiences this pattern, they may begin questioning their own value or judgment. They may wonder whether they were not enough, whether they misunderstood the relationship, or whether they are being emotionally manipulated. Over time, these thoughts can lead to anxiety, emotional dependency, and difficulty trusting future partners. The brain becomes conditioned to expect inconsistency in relationships, which can influence long-term emotional patterns. Psychologists often analyze such situations by observing behavioral consistency, emotional accountability, and communication patterns. They pay attention to emotional triggers during conversation, changes in tone, and the way individuals respond to vulnerability. For example, when discussing past conflicts, a psychologically mature individual tends to show reflection and empathy. They acknowledge mistakes and demonstrate understanding of how their actions affected the other person. In contrast, defensive reactions, blame shifting, or emotional withdrawal often indicate unresolved psychological defenses. Another important element psychologists study is attachment style. Attachment theory explains how early life experiences shape the way people approach intimacy and emotional closeness. Some individuals develop secure attachment, which allows them to form stable and trusting relationships. Others develop avoidant attachment, where emotional closeness triggers discomfort. Avoidant individuals often withdraw when relationships become emotionally intense. However, after distance restores their sense of independence, they may return seeking connection again. This push-pull dynamic can explain why some men disappear and later return. The internal conflict between desire for connection and fear of vulnerability creates inconsistent behavior patterns. Anxious attachment can also influence this behavior. People with anxious attachment sometimes return because unresolved emotional bonds create persistent psychological tension. Their minds struggle to achieve closure without reconnecting. From a mental health perspective, these dynamics can have lasting effects. Unclear relationship endings often create emotional rumination. The mind repeatedly analyzes past conversations, decisions, and what-if scenarios. This mental loop consumes emotional energy and can reduce focus on personal growth or future relationships. Long-term exposure to such emotional cycles may contribute to stress, self-doubt, or emotional exhaustion. It can make individuals hesitant to trust new relationships or overly cautious about its emotional vulnerability. Ultimately, when a man comes back after months of no contact, psychology teaches us to look beyond the surface explanation. Human behavior is rarely driven by a single emotion. It is shaped by memory, ego, attachment patterns, loneliness, curiosity, regret, and the brain's natural tendency to revisit unfinished emotional experiences. Understanding these psychological mechanisms does not necessarily provide a simple answer about whether reconnection will succeed, but it does provide clarity. It allows people to evaluate behavior rather than relying solely on words, encourages observation of consistency, emotional responsibility, and genuine personal growth. Because in the end, what truly defines the meaning of someone returning is not just the fact that they came back, but the psychological transformation or lack of transformation that occurred while they were gone.